Let's dive right into this explainer. Look, we live in a world that is absolutely obsessed with hacking happiness and boosting our emotional intelligence. Seriously, every day there's a new app, a new journal, or some new course promising to completely optimize our minds. But what if the ultimate blueprint for a joyful, emotionally intelligent life wasn't cooked up in some modern psychology lab, but was actually written down thousands of years ago? You know, we constantly hear about EQ, emotional intelligence, in corporate seminars, leadership books, and psychology podcasts. It really feels like a super modern invention, right? Well, today we are unpacking a really fascinating new academic paper by Anne-Marie Hsiung that totally challenges this assumption. This research reveals that the deep roots of what we now just call EQ are actually embedded in ancient Eastern and Western texts. We're going to look at how these ancient traditions perfectly mapped out the human mind centuries before modern science even caught up. Right off the bat, we've got to reframe how modern social science currently views well-being. Leading happiness researchers like Harvard's Arthur C. Brooks view joy not as a fleeting mood or, a stroke of good luck, but as a deliberate practice. It's a skill. And just like any skill, whether it's learning to play the piano or speaking a completely new language, it requires intentional, daily practice to master. Okay, so enter emotional intelligence. Popularized by psychologist Daniel Goleman back in the 1990s, EQ gives us a structural framework to actually measure these trainable capacities. Goleman organized EQ into four main buckets: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. And the key takeaway here is that this isn't about fixed traits you're just simply born with. These are highly learnable habits that build our capacity for resilience and empathy. To put this into perspective, think about how our happiness is actually partitioned. Sonia Lyubomirsky and Arthur Brooks found that while our genetic baseline accounts for about 50% of our happiness and our circumstances account for 25%, a full 25% is dictated entirely by our intentional habits and activities. That 25%, that is our lever for change. And to figure out exactly how to pull that lever, we are going to look to the ancients. Section 1. Confucian Joy in Learning, the Eastern Pillar of Self-Cultivation. Way before cognitive behavioral therapy was even a thing, ancient Chinese philosophy offered this incredibly rigorous, practice-based system for emotional growth. When you dig into ancient texts like the Analects and the Mencius, it's clear that Confucius viewed joy and lifelong learning as absolutely inseparable. I mean, literally the very first line of the Analects asks, "Is it not a joy to learn and practice what you have learned at the proper time?" Joy, in this tradition, isn't about amusement or just having fun. It's the natural byproduct of moral refinement, self-examination, and gathering with like-minded friends to cultivate character. The whole point of this kind of learning was to become a jinzi, which translates to an exemplary or profound person. Let's look at a concrete example from the text instead of just abstract ideas. Confucius heavily praised his disciple Yan Hui. Now, Yan Hui lived in this humble, narrow alley with just a single basket of food and a gourd of water. Definitely not your modern luxury wellness retreat, right? Yet, while anyone else would have been completely miserable, Yan Hui never lost his joy. This perfectly proves that for the ancients, joy is a cultivated inner state. It becomes completely independent of your external circumstances. So how exactly do you achieve that inner state? Well, the ancient text called The Great Learning outlines this incredible step-by-step model. It shows that emotional regulation starts completely internally with sincerity of thought. Once you master yourself, that balance naturally ripples outward. It moves to ordering your family, then to governing the state, and finally to harmonizing all of society. You basically can't fix the world until you fix your own inner emotional landscape. Moving on to Section 2. Biblical resilience, the Western pillar of grace and community. Now, while the Eastern tradition focuses heavily on human moral cultivation, the Western biblical tradition offers a slightly different but totally parallel pathway to emotional endurance. In the wisdom traditions of the Old Testament, like Proverbs and the New Testament letters of the Apostle Paul, joy is completely decoupled from whatever mood you happen to be in. Instead, it's framed as a divine gift and a really steady posture that anchors you, even during severe trials. Proverbs even tells us that a joyful heart is good medicine, framing well-being as something that renews the whole person, mind and body alike. Now here is where the traditions explicitly diverge a bit. Confucianism focuses heavily on disciplined, human moral effort to align with heaven's mandate. The biblical perspective, on the other hand, centers on divine grace, repentance, and the work of the Spirit. But here's the catch. Despite these completely different starting points of human effort versus divine grace, both traditions demand rigorous, lifelong character formation. They both entirely agree that true joy requires profound, active inner transformation. The Apostle Paul is honestly a perfect example of this resilient joy in action. In his letter to the Philippians, which, by the way, was written while he was literally imprisoned, joy just permeates every single chapter. He models joy in suffering, joy in serving others, joy in believing, and joy in giving. Paul actually wrote that he had learned the secret to being content in any and every situation, whether he was well-fed or hungry, living in plenty or in want. This ancient text demonstrates a level of emotional regulation that modern psychology bends over backward trying to teach today. Okay, section 3, the ancient roots of EQ, synthesizing all this timeless wisdom. Let's bridge these ancient texts directly back to our 4 modern EQ domains. This right here is kind of the ultimate aha moment of our explainer, where modern science and ancient wisdom just lock together perfectly. Think about self-awareness. In the East, it's the Confucian daily examen. In the West, it's the biblical prayer, "Search me, God." Or self-management. Confucius taught ritual propriety, while the Book of James literally says to be slow to anger. They obviously didn't have the phrase emotional intelligence, but they had the exact practical frameworks for developing every single pillar of it. Let's actually zoom in on self-management for a second. The Confucian sequence from the Great Learning moves from knowing where to abide to being steady, tranquil, at ease, and finally able to deliberate and attain. Guys, this is an ancient, step-by-step masterclass in what modern psychologists now call attention regulation. It is essentially a blueprint for mindfulness, teaching us how to find our equilibrium before our emotions hijack our behavior. And what about social awareness? Well, both traditions championed empathy long before modern social science got involved. Confucius championed harmony without uniformity, which is this brilliant idea that we can empathize and work together even when we are totally different. Meanwhile, the Apostle Paul urged believers to rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. Both traditions deeply recognize that emotional maturity isn't just about managing yourself in a vacuum. It's intensely relational. It is all about how you connect with and support the community around you. Finally, section 4, a timeless formula for joy, merging science with metaphysics. So what is the actual payoff of blending our modern scientific checklists with this transcendent wisdom? Because knowing the neuroscience of the brain is one thing, but applying it to live a meaningful life, that's another entirely. Author David Brooks argues that modern society is way too focused on what he calls Adam I, or resume virtues. External success, wealth, status, all that. He argues we urgently need to cultivate Adam II, or eulogy virtues like humility, love, and moral depth. Because when we focus on those eulogy virtues, we build the kind of deep moral joy that simply doesn't crumble when life inevitably gets hard. In a very similar vein, Arthur Brooks points us to 4 key habits, or pillars, for a happy life: faith, family, friendship, and work, but specifically work framed as service to others. Notice how perfectly these echo our ancient texts? Faith mirrors the biblical reliance on grace and the Confucian reverence for heaven. Family and friendship completely mirror the deep relational joy championed by both traditions. It goes to show that modern science desperately needs the soul of philosophy and ethics to create a truly resilient life. And this brings us to a massive realization. As Arthur Brooks points out, data alone just cannot secure our well-being. We could understand the neuroscience of our brains perfectly down to the last synapse, but without meaning, deep human connection, and a guiding life philosophy, we're still going to feel empty. We absolutely need the scientific how paired with the ancient why. So, as we wrap up, we've traveled from modern psychology labs to the ancient alleyways of Chinese sages and straight into the prison cell of the Apostle Paul. The evidence is pretty undeniable. True emotional intelligence isn't just some app you download. It is a profound, lifelong practice. So, I leave you with this to think about. Instead of asking how you can hack your happiness today, what intentional, ancient habit will you practice to build your own unbreakable moral joy?